About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs alongside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, a grotesque garden where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills. A fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with transcendent effort, of ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally, a line of grey cars crawls along an invisible track, comes to rest and gives it a ghastly creak. And immediately, ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades. Ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud which screens that obscure operation from your sight. But above the grey land, and the spasms of bleak dust that drift endlessly over it, you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. The retinas are 1 yard high, and they look out of no face, but instead out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or else forgot about them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small, foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let the barges through, passengers in the waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for as long as half an hour. There's always a halt here of at least a minute, and it is because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular cafes with her, and leaving her at a table, sauntered about, chatting with whomsoever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her, but I did. When going to New York with Tom on the train one afternoon, as we stopped by the ash heaps, he jumped to his feet and, taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he said. "I want you to meet my girl." I think he'd tanked up a good bit at luncheon. Or I suspect he'd tanked up a good deal at luncheon. I think he'd tanked up a good deal at luncheon. And his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The supercilious assumption... Is it a supercilious assumption? The supercilious assumption was on a Sunday afternoon I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence and back along the road 100 yards under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only buildings in sight were a small square of yellow brick sitting on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street ministering to it and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the 3 shops it contained was for rent, another was an all-night diner approached by a trail of ashes, and the third was a garage, cars, George B. Wilson. Repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold, and I followed Tom inside. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the doorway of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. A damp gleam of hope sprang into... He was a blonde man. He was a blonde, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. A damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes when he saw us. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old boy." I missed the dust-covered wreck of the Ford. "Hello, Wilson, old boy. Old man," said Tom, slapping him jovially on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," said Wilson, unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week. I've got my man working on it now." "Works pretty slow, don't he?" "No," said Tom coldly, "and if you feel that way about it, Maybe I'd better sell it somewhere else after all. I didn't mean that, said Wilson hurriedly. It's just that. His voice trailed off, and Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on a stairs, and the thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office door. She was in her middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her flesh sensuously, as some women can. Her face, above a spotted dress of dark blue crepe de Chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if all the nerves in her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly and, walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. She wet her lips and, without turning around, spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. "Get some chairs, why don't you, so someone can sit down." "Oh, right," said Wilson, hurrying off towards the garage, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled everything and veiled his pale hair and his dark suit, as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except his wife, who moved closer to Tom. "I want to see you," he said. "Get on the next train." "All right. We'll meet you on the lower level by the newsstand." She nodded and moved away from Tom just as George Wilson appeared in the doorway of the office carrying 2 chairs. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. It was a few days before the 4th of July, and we watched a gray, scrawny Italian child set torpedoes along the road. I think that's right. "Terrible place, isn't it?" said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. "It does her good to get away." "Terrible place," said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. "Awful. It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband object? Wilson? He thinks she goes to see her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive." And so, Tom Buchanan, his girl, and I took the train together up to New York. We're not quite together, for Miss Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibility of those East Eggers who may have been on the train. She had changed her dress into a brown-figured muslin, which clung to her wide hips as Tom helped her down to the platform in New York. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of the Town Tattle and some of the Broadway Scandal and a moving pictures magazine. And at the drugstore, she bought a flask of perfume and some cold cream. In the solemn, echoing drive, she let 4 taxicabs drive away before selecting a new one, gray in color with lavender interior. No, lavender in color with a gray upholstery. And in this, we slid out from the station into the glowing sunshine. But immediately, Miss Wilson turned from the window and tapped on the glass. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said, earnestly. Eagerly. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said, eagerly. "They're a nice thing to have, a dog. For the apartment. They're a nice thing to have, a dog." We backed up to an old gray man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. In a basket swung from his neck cowered a dozen or so very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. "What kind are they?" asked Miss Wilson eagerly. I think it goes earnestly, eagerly, enthusiastically. "What kind are they?" asked Miss Wilson eagerly. "All kinds. What kind do you want, lady?" "I'd like to get one of those police dogs," she said. "I don't suppose you got that kind." The man peered doubtfully into his basket, plunged in a hand, and drew one up, wriggling by the back of the neck. "That's no police dog," said Tom. It's not exactly a police... No, it's not a police dog exactly," said the man with disappointment in his voice. "It's more of an Airedale." He ran a hand over the brown wash rag of a back. "Look at that coat. Some coat. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching a cold." The Airedale... Surely there was some Airedale mixed up in there somewhere, though its paws were startlingly white. Changed hands and settled down into Mrs. Wilson's lap, where she fondled the weatherproof coat with rapture. "Is it a boy or a girl?" she asked delicately. "That girl? It's a boy," said the man. Oh, I forgot. I missed the part about how much it costs. Anyway, "It's a bitch," said Tom. "Here's your money. Go and buy 10 more dogs with it." We drove over to 5th Avenue. Warm and soft, almost pastoral, on a sunny summer afternoon. I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep turn the corner. "Hold on," I said. "I've got to leave you here." "No, you don't," interposed Tom quickly. "Besides, Myrtle will be hurt if you don't come up to the apartment." "Come on," said Miss Wilson. I'll telephone my sister. She's said to be quite beautiful by people who ought to know. Said to be quite beautiful by people who ought to know. We drove on, cutting back over to the West Hundreds to 158th Street, where we pulled up to one slice in a long white cake of apartment houses. Throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson gathered up her dog and her other purchases and went haughtily in. "I'm going to have the McKees come up," she announced as we rose in the elevator, "and of course I've got to telephone my sister as well." The apartment was located on the top floor. A small living room, a small bedroom, a small kitchen and a bath? Fuck. The living room was crowded to the doors with tapestried furniture far too large for it, so to move about was to stumble continually over scenes of women swinging in the gardens of Versailles. On the coffee table there was a copy of Simon Called Peter and some Broadway scandal sheets. A reluctant elevator boy was sent for a box of straw and some milk, to which he added of his own volition, or his own initiative, a box of hard dog biscuits, one of which sat decomposing apathetically in a saucer of milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau door. I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon, so everything that happened has a dim, hazy cast over it, even though until 8 o'clock the apartment was full of bright sunlight. I think this is where I missed something. Sitting on Tom's lap, Mrs. Wilson made telephone calls. And then there were no cigarettes, so I went out to the corner drugstore to buy some. When I returned, Tom and Miss Wilson had vanished. So I sat down in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either the whiskey had distorted things or it was terrible stuff because it made no sense to me. When Tom and Myrtle, after our first drink, we called each other by our first names, reappeared, company commenced arriving at the apartment door. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30 with a solid, sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. The eyebrows had been plucked and drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature towards the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. There was an incessant clicking as she moved about, as innumerable pottery bracelets jangled up and down her arms. She came in with such proprietary haste and looked at the furniture so possessively, I wondered if she lived there. When I asked this, however, she repeated the question aloud, laughed immoderately, and said that she lived in an hotel with a girlfriend. Mr. McKee was a slender, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, for there was a spot of white lather on his cheek, and he was most respectful in his greetings to everyone in the room. He told me he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later he was a photographer, and it was he who had taken the over-enlarged photograph of Mrs. McKee's mother, of Mrs. Wilson's mother, that hung on the wall like an ectoplasm. I forgot about the picture before. His wife was shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. She informed us that her husband had photographed her 127 times since they'd been married. Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume some time before and was now in an elaborate evening chiffon that rustled continually. And with the change of costume had come a change of personality. Gone was the vitality from the garage and replaced with an impressive hauteur. Her laugh, her gestures grew more animated as the night went on, and as she grew larger, the apartment grew smaller, until she was revolving on a noisy, creaking pivot in the smoky air. "These fellows will cheat you every time," she yelled to her sister. "To only think about one thing." This is all shaky. "I had a woman up here to look at my feet and when she gave me the bill, you'd think I'd had my appendicitis out." "What was her name?" asked Mrs. Wilson. Asked Mrs. McKee. "Mrs. Eberhardt. She looks at people's feet in their homes." "I love you in that dress," said Mrs. McKee. "This thing?" Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment with a raised eyebrow. "It's just something I throw on when I don't care what I look like." "But it looks wonderful on you," insisted Miss McKee. "If Chester could get you in that pose, I think he could really make something of it." We all looked in silence at Mrs. Wilson, who removed a hair from her eye. Okay, that's all I got right now. First one of 2020.